Welcome to School Talk with the Shrewsbury School Committee. Our topic for this segment is the budget. The school committee has formalized our budget request to town meeting for fiscal year 2019, which of course lines up with the coming school year. Tonight, we'll be discussing our budget of $64,137,607, and specifically our process for developing that figure. What are some of the factors driving budget growth? What the budget includes, what it does not include, and some of our concerns for the long-term financial trends facing Shrewsbury Public Schools. Stay tuned.
Welcome. I'm Dale McGee, Chairman of the School Committee, and in addition to Jason Palish, we're joined today by John Wensky, Aaron Canzano, and Sandy Fritz, and we're going to talk to you about the school budget, the development process, as well as just the long-term consequences of the way this has been going over the past decade or so and what we project for the future. We're going to start by just talking about where we are right now with this budget process. As we shoot this, we are just before town meeting, but we have voted on a final budget recommendation for the town meeting. Sandy, what can you tell us about that?
Sure. First, let's talk about the budget goals. What were our goals as we set forth going on the FY19 budget? We talked about maintaining current educational program, meeting mandates, address enrollment growth, but also achieve our strategic goals and priorities as we move forward. And that is what we call a carry-forward budget. And a little different this year, we added to that, again, like we said, mandates. We want to make sure the things we have to do are in that budget. So the initial rollout was Dr. Sawyer's superintendent recommendation back in January, and that was for a 6.47% increase, a little over $4 million. At the same time, a few weeks later, the town manager came out with his priority or initial budget, and his was for a 2.41% increase. So it was a significant difference. We had a $2.5 million gap. Since then, we had an update on the 25th of April. The town manager was able to give us another $260,000, a little more than that. So we stand at a 2.83% budget increase. It is not at the amount that we needed to proceed with the carry forward budget. And we'll talk about how we got to our tier reductions, the methodology that went into that. But as we sit here, we know that we're carrying forward a large budget gap going into the next year.
So in addition to our priorities, I think one thing that we want to make clear is that our goal is to offer the same services from year to year. We want to make sure that students entering the first grade or entering high school or whatever are getting the same quality product year in, year out. And so that is why we refer to this as a level services budget.
Right.
But we found in the past that that isn't always the case.
Exactly.
Certainly, and I think what's important for folks to understand, because this is of course a complicated process that isn't always easy to follow, but to your point, as our budget experiences growth, we have a lot of built-in cost drivers that are necessary to maintain the quality of the program the way it is now, and some of which are legally required. When students move into the district or who already are in the district require certain services, special education services, other pupil services, those requirements are put into place by federal law. Items related to most of our salaries and benefits are contractually obligated. So we have just to move the program forward from one year to the next, not necessarily growing it, not necessarily improving it in all of the ways that we might hope for or want to realize for the kids. But just to keep things the way they are, it is a substantial additional investment. And I think that that's important to understand because it can be difficult to look at increases year after year and understand why there might still be a problem. Why might we be coming back to the community every year and saying we are headed down a dark path? Because not only does maintaining the program as it is now require an additional investment, but everything we have to cut back, there's that phrase, they found the money.
Right.
We don't find the money, we take things out of the program, and in 1 year it may not seem like a lot, but it adds up over time.
I was thinking about our pattern of deferrals, how we defer especially equipment and the purchase of, I think in this case, if we're going to talk about that, the projectors throughout the district. And when you've done this a long time, you can see the trend that now we're starting to dig a hole. and we're starting to get behind. And so this trend is concerning to me, even though we're finding ways to close that gap, but the long-term consequences, I think, are going to be significant.
And I think this topic about found money needs to be clarified a little more because of the way the budget process works. We get the recommendation from the superintendent at the beginning of January, but that number matures as the months continue, as we get the number from the town manager, the preliminary number from the town manager, and then trying to take a look at the services, the mandated services we need, along with keeping up with enrollment growth and what services are needed for the enrollment coming into town, and the unpredictability of that number contributes to how that number matures, right? So, I think it's important for the public to understand that this is a process, and
And it's a very fluid process, like you
Exactly.
stated. Things change between January and April. We had some significant changes that we can't foresee. And one thing we did ask prior to the first budget recommendation was a real sharpening of the pencils to make sure that everything we thought was included, or things that didn't need to be there were not.
Right.
And I think this is, like you said, something that people do need to understand. It's extremely fluid.
And of course, we're on the same fiscal year that the Commonwealth is on, so the state budget is happening at exactly the same time.
Right.
They have a very protracted process where the governor has to put forward a number, then the House and the Senate have to do theirs. It's a month for each branch. It has to be reconciled. We are the recipients of a fairly significant portion of state funding, so that process is happening at the exact same time, so there's a lot of moving pieces.
Right, right. And I think there are a number of things that are going on. When we talk about it maturing, I think the idea here is that in January, we're guessing how much money we're going to spend between January and May, or between January and July. And then by the time we get around to April or May, some of those are real numbers now. We've seen that perhaps we didn't spend as much as we had projected with our previous budget, and so that's a fortunate thing, and that's what happened this year. We were able to realize some savings from the actual budget, and that cut some of the pressure off of the process.
Right.
By the same token, when they develop these tiers, the process is fairly easy to understand. They try to look at things they can put off. They try to look at things that may be able to increase class size a little bit, but not a whole lot. They look at subjects that may not be measured by the MCAS scores first, and therefore the net effect is not going to be felt as significantly, in the hopes that we can improve it in the future. But that's the way the process goes each time. And when we defer things, we always hope that perhaps another year will be rosier, but what we're learning is that often when things go away, they stay away.
They do.
So we'll talk about that a little bit
Right.
more in the future.
And I think Dr. Sawyer and his staff do an excellent job of working through how do we meet the budget that the town can afford in the least harm to the district, least harm to the students. But Erin raises a good point that we are seeing reductions again in pent-up demand, and some of the items that if we're not purchasing, they just become more expensive down the road. So it's really, that hole just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Right.
And of course, you mentioned the tier system where the superintendent and his team had recommended 3 potential tiers of cuts. And of course, we're very grateful that the money was able to be provided to cover that most urgent tier. Having said that, if you look at the other 2, those are real things. Those are real positions providing real services. Those are real materials that if we don't invest in this year, we're going to have to invest in them in the future. There's no guarantee that they're going to be the same price or less expensive. And those are real services not being provided. And again, year to year, it's something that the district can probably absorb. But we are probably in our 3rd or 4th year, post 2014, having to make difficult choices. And the further you walk down this path, the more they start to add up.
That's right.
And it's absorbed at a cost.
Right.
There's something has to give in order for one other priority to move forward. And I think, as John said, it fluctuates. And depending on, we could have, move-ins, and dollars could be that we don't even know we need in the budget we're going to need. So
Right, and I
tough.
think the gains that we saw in fiscal year 2014 after the override we're slowly chipping away at, where we're deferring services and programs that we're not seeing come back as a result because there are priorities elsewhere.
And one area, there was sort of a little bit of a theme going through some of the things that wound up in these various tiers. We had additional nursing staff needed, some of which we were able to provide for, some not. But also there was the recommendation for senior level staffing to focus on social emotional learning. Some of the issues related to anxiety, mental and emotional health challenges that students are experiencing are particularly extreme, they're getting worse, and they consume a large portion of staff time and resources as is necessary. Staff need to make sure that kids are safe, that kids are mentally and emotionally healthy, that they're coming to school ready to learn, that they're in an environment ready to learn. And if you don't hear principals talking about what their day is like, you can look at some of those things on paper and you can think that maybe it's a nice to have. But when you hear our middle school principals talking about their day, and sometimes it sounds like you're listening to an emergency room triage administrator.
Exactly.
I mean, those positions make a difference, and not having them makes a difference.
Right. Our district has 6,100 students, and the nursing staff had over 2,600 visits related to emotional issues just in 1 year. So that points to just how significant an issue this is. And I think over the past few years, what we've looked at is we've looked at trends, both within our district and in other school districts, to look at what is a reasonable rate of inflation as to what we can expect. We're always proud of the fact that Shrewsbury is a very efficient district, that our costs per student are among the lowest in the state. And that is true, but that doesn't exempt us from the normal cost increases that occur. In fact, there's less fat to be trimmed. And so we need to be very wary of this. And the conclusion we came to was that 3 to 4% a year is a reasonable expectation. And that if we are below that, then we are in a position of cutting services. And so it is that expectation that we need to make people understand, so they can better understand the pressures that we're under. Now, in addition to the normal inflation rate, we do have issues regarding volatility, and so the other problems that we run into have to do with the fact that, particularly with special education and the like, there can be significant sways from year to year. This is a complex topic, but basically what it boils down to is that there are some students who require very intense services, and these services are not something that are negotiable. These are something that absolutely are required. By the same token, the state sets the expenses for that. This is not something that we can negotiate in any way. And they do offer us some relief in something referred to as the circuit breaker, which they promise to pay 75% of the cost above a certain threshold, so that districts are less exposed to that volatility that can be so difficult for districts to absorb. But the problem we have run into is that the promise and the reality don't always match, and that a part of the roller coaster we've been on this year has been the fact that the initial 75% promise then came in at 65 and then gradually cranked up a little bit. But what that was putting millions of dollars in play, and that we needed to scratch around and try to find places for those millions of dollars to be
And
found.
I think that roller coaster is the most nerve-wracking part of being in the roles that we're in right now, because we don't know the way it's going to swing. I think we've had a positive swing in our favor, whether it comes to special ed or other services that have helped that budget process mature in our favor, but that's
Other
not
years it hasn't.
exactly.
It's gone the other way.
And I think if you look at the history of the budget cycles going back to 2010 and I think 2012, we did see it swing in a negative way, and that's why we had to look at making more cuts, which ended up leading to that critical 2014 override decision to kind of save a lot of the services we have in the schools.
And to your point about legal requirements surrounding special education, if you look at a private business, for example, if you have a revenue stream dedicated to supporting a particular program or expense, if the revenue isn't there, you can simply opt not to do what it was that was there. We don't have that option when it comes to educating students, especially when it comes to special education, where state and federal laws require those services to be provided. And by the way, we would provide them anyway, because that is a value that we as a school committee and department share. But we can't react to a loss of revenue by deciding not to educate children. When you look at the services performed in a public school district, the vast majority of it is not discretionary. We have to teach subjects that are required by the Commonwealth. We have to provide meals, nursing services. So what we actually have choices over is a fairly narrow window of things that keep getting hit and keep getting hit, and then it turns to staffing levels,
Right.
which is
Right.
not a road that we want to walk back down, because obviously it was the severe shortage in staffing, the severely overcrowded classrooms, the class sizes leading up to 2014 that really took us to the brink of crisis, where we actually started to see student performance taking a hit.
And if we sort of go back and look at why this is happening to us now, what has changed, what is different, we always hear reference to Proposition 2.5, to the law that limits the increase in property tax, the total amount collected in property tax to 2.5% a year, plus whatever new growth comes into town. And we hear about the fact that we have always run a very efficient town. We hear about the fact that our school costs have always been among the lowest, so there's never been much fat for us to deal with. And yet we made it to 2014 without having an override. And the question there is how could that be? And in fact, when we look back at the trend in budgets, we see that basically things were under reasonable control until around 2004, so 2005, in that area there. And then since 2005, that's when a lot of the fees started getting layering in as the district started running out of money. Before 2004, 2005, athletics was no fee, buses were no fee, activities were no fee.
No fees.
And so these things got layered on, and we have been in the position of increasing those fees to try to maximize our revenue from that source. In addition to that, I've asked the heads of the PTOs just how much they are contributing to the district. And I think most people not connected with the schools would think, well, they have a little bake sale and
That's
they
right.
might buy some balloons
Not
for
so
a
much.
party.
Yeah.
But in fact, it looks like the PTOs are contributing approximately $250,000 a year, purchasing projectors, purchasing whiteboards, things like that.
It's not field trips and the things that we all enjoy.
Necessities.
Right.
They are
Right.
helping to deal with these budget shortfalls that we run into.
Yeah, it's a key contributor to every school is the PTO and the dedicated teams that they assemble, the volunteers that really go out of their way to provide opportunity to raise those funds and to put them into the hardware that's needed, the critical things that are needed within the school, in addition to programs that maybe we wouldn't be able to offer otherwise.
Yeah.
And to your point about, how did Shrewsbury go so long before we hit a crisis point? Well, you can look we had such rapid growth, and Shrewsbury's still growing as a community, and that's actually a comment on the community and the quality of the schools. It's a nice place to live. We're still growing. But you look, there were 2 years running in the 1990s. We were the fastest growing in the state. That sent revenues through the roof.
Right.
New construction, new families coming in, kids not necessarily in the school system yet. We were able to sort of dine out on new growth for many, many years. And then when you get to fiscal 2005 and we started cutting, well, from the outside looking in, it might not have been that severe. It's similar to what we're doing now, this year with the budget.
Right.
It's a few cuts here and there, nothing that's going to severely impact the quality of the program. Do that for 1 year, you're fine.
Right.
Do that for 3 years, it's going to start to be noticeable.
Yeah.
We did that
Cumulative.
for a decade
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Shrewsbury, and it precipitated a crisis that actually led to a decline in student performance.
Right.
And we're sitting here as a school committee now saying, we're okay today, but this is the red flag. We don't want to go back there tomorrow.
Right.
We're in a cycle, and
Yeah.
I think that we need to educate the public with regard to why today is different than it has been since 1982, when Proposition 2.5 was implemented. And we've learned several things. We've looked at the town population, and the assumption has always been that if people move into Shrewsbury, they have children, they send them to our schools, and therefore actually people moving in is raising costs for the local municipalities as opposed to raising revenues. And in fact, that has not always been the case at all. If we look at the population growth that occurred in Shrewsbury, interestingly, if we go back all the way to the 1950s and the like, when the population was just over 10,000 people, it's been growing very regularly up until about 2010. But the interesting thing is that from 1970 until 1990, the student population actually dropped. And so that mitigated some of the cost issues that occur with educating students. The number of students we had to educate was actually dropping, and it wasn't until 2001 that the student population grew back to where it was in 1970. And so that bought us a little bit of time. That's one thing that was different. And the other thing to look at is the fact that Shrewsbury's aid from for their annualized growth has been basically tapering down. Just as Jason mentioned, there was this wild growth back in the 90s, and actually even before that a little bit. But it's tapered down since the 2000s, tapered down more since 2010. The population of Shrewsbury, per the most recent town report, is essentially the same as it was in 2010. And so the adult population isn't changing much at all now. And that trend that I mentioned about adults growing but the students decreasing has reversed. We have the student population increasing, but we have the adult population essentially staying flat. So that changes the dynamic and puts a little bit more pressure on the municipality.
And that growth, part of that growth can be seen in the high school, right?
No,
We had-
absolutely.
Right.
In 2002, and here we are in 2018, and the enrollment is up 65%.
Right.
Right.
Just in high
Right.
school.
Right.
And we used to talk about the bubble, which is the current
Sure.
sophomore class, I believe.
Right.
That was a bubble. Well, we don't have a bubble. It's a steady increase now.
Exactly,
I mean, that's
exactly.
Right.
and the high school is expected to be even higher next year.
That's right.
And where will they all go?
Right.
And of course, the world is a very different place than it was 40 years ago. And you look at something like Proposition 2.5, which, sometimes people will think, oh, 2.5%, shouldn't that be a reasonable measurement of good growth and good government? The reality was that in Massachusetts in the early 1980s, you had some municipalities with bloated budgets, and that was a starvation diet. That was meant to shrink the size of some municipal budgets that had really gotten out of control. And Shrewsbury at the time had a relatively low property tax rate, which we
Right.
got locked into. So the fact of the matter is, when we talk about something like that, we're not talking about an objective measurement of good management and growth. We're talking about political decisions that were made 4 decades ago,
Right.
that we're being held hostage to. Now, the world is a very different place. We pride ourselves here in Shrewsbury, as Dale mentioned, on controlling our costs. There have been several years where we have been in the bottom 10% of per pupil spending, but pick just about any performance metric you want of Massachusetts public schools. You usually find us in the top 10%. That's astounding.
Right.
We take great pride in our efficiency. We take great pride in the value that we're able to deliver to residents, but there does come a breaking point. There does come a point where cutting costs, and again, as we're seeing the budget go up, it can be difficult to understand that, but those cost drivers drive the cost of things up. It slowly will start to chip away at that program, and we don't want to go back to where we were 4 years ago.
Right.
Right.
And we have a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers to make sure that we are spending the money as efficiently as possible. But I think one data point that always amazes me, if we were spending at the state average per pupil, we would need almost another $16 million in our budget
Right.
just to get to the state average. So we are a very efficient school district with very high results, but you can't continue that trend. And I think that's what we've talked about as we were heading into the first override. That trend was starting to really tank.
Right. There were a number of other factors. As I mentioned, there was a lot of growth in the adult population in housing and construction. This fed growth in the town budget, even though the existing real estate was held to 2.5% increase. The fact is that during those days of the 80s and 90s, we were basically realizing 5 or so percent increases in revenues for the town. And so we were able to run the operation within the bounds of Proposition 2.5 because we weren't operating under 2.5. We were running on 5%, which is a more realistic thing. Since then, however, the growth has tapered, and so what we're seeing is we're heading down towards 3% growth per year, somewhere in that range, which is getting really tight for us. By the same token, the state, with its aid, is basically trying to send the aid where the need is greatest. And so when they measure the wealth of Shrewsbury, either by income or by real estate, they find that we're basically in the wealthier third of the state. And so what they have been doing is tapering off their aid. So whereas our overall budget may need to increase by 3 or 4% a year, the fact is that the quarter or so of the budget that is provided by state aid is essentially flat. And so that has been shifting a lot of the costs over to the town. And the only lever the town has in raising funds at this point is property tax, really, unless everyone goes out and buys a new car. So,
Which we would highly encourage.
That's right.
but so these are the kinds of pressures we're dealing with, and thus we have this gap. Thus we present a level services budget. The town has been coming to us with a budget that is less, and there is a gap every year in the ballpark of $1.5 or $2 million. And this is something that has occurred repeatedly over the past decade or so, and we need to deal with it. And the way we deal with it, we talked earlier about tiers, but where we go with it is basically decreasing services, as the graphic shows. And that is what the public needs to be aware of.
And I think that the superintendent has done an excellent job of ending each and every one of his budget presentations with the same essential question. I know, Sandy, you've got in front of you, pull out that last slide, but the essential question, of course, is what will our community do to solve the structural funding dilemma that jeopardizes the future quality of public education in Shrewsbury? He put it a lot better than I can, that's why I wanted the slide. But it is the essential question that we as a committee are going to need to keep bringing to the community, along with the superintendent, for as long as it's going to take until we address what is a structural problem. And again, it's difficult to, because we're not sitting here today talking about an emergency. We're talking about a problem that is going to be borne out over a long period of time. We feel, as responsible stewards of the taxpayers' money, we want the community to understand now the path we're walking down, so we don't get to the end of that path and need to declare that a crisis exists.
Right.
Right.
We don't want to cut all those services. We don't want the crisis. People who have been through that Proposition 2.5 override don't want to go through it again.
I certainly
That's
do
right.
not.
And so I think what it boils down to is what can we anticipate? How can we apply small amounts of resources year upon year to try to form a commitment to level services, to basically say, rather than start with amount of money, start with a commitment to saying we need to provide level services for our students and for our entire town.
Right.
All of the services that we provide in this town, I think there needs to be a commitment to the quality that exists year upon year. And I think that is one of the most important things that we need to transition from the start with the dollars to basically start with the services.
Right. And we have strategic priorities and goals that were crafted with the community, with staff, and this is where we want to go over the next 5 years. But in order to do that, we're going to need adequate funding. And what I think is concerning is we have a large budget gap this year, but it was a very quiet year from the public. We did not get a lot of feedback on our budget. We really had no one attend budget hearings. So I hope people are paying attention, because this is a very serious path that we're definitely heading right back on.
Well, and I think where they'll find it is what, Dale, you were talking about, is they have a child in first grade, and then they go on, and then their second child comes in and goes through first grade, and say, well,
What's
there's
the
a difference.
Right.
There's a difference. And I think that's where you're going to start having people
Right.
pay attention.
So I think that the idea here, though, is basically to have these conversations before we have a crisis, to
Right.
anticipate it, to realize that this is a process that is predictable, that we have trends that we can project into the future, that we understand this. It doesn't involve waste. It involves basically realistic expectations and a commitment to the community to provide level services. So we've had a good conversation regarding the budgets, and I really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you for joining us.